Thank you for joining our webinar, EU MDR, Tackling Today's Challenges. Our webinar sponsor is MedTorque. MedTorque is a world-class manufacturer of orthopedic instruments and implants. The company designs, engineers, and manufactures its own line of orthopedic instruments, as well as orthopedic companies' highly complex products. MedTorque's focus on customer partnerships drives innovation and product launch success. Our moderator today is regulatory consultant Sharon Starowitz. She's put together an esteemed group of panelists, and I'm going to hand it over to Sharon now to introduce our panel and our discussion.
Thank you, Carolyn, for the introduction. Today, I'm very delighted to join a distinguished panel of experts who'll be sharing their thoughts on the current status of the European medical device regulation, its impact, challenges, and opportunities, from the unique perspectives of both notified bodies and of industry. So we're going to start by hearing from our notified bodies. And to kick this off, I'd like to introduce Dr. Matthias Fink, who certainly is not a stranger to OMTEC. Dr. Fink is presently the clinical focus team manager at TÜV Süd and is an orthopedic trauma surgeon by training and practice. Joining Dr. Fink is Kevin Madden, who is the team training lead and technical team manager for orthopedic and dental devices and regulatory services for BSI. We're also joined by Dr. Basel Akra, who previously worked for a notified body and is now the CEO and co-owner of Qunique GmbH, a consulting firm specializing in developing tailored solutions to support, maintain, and improve compliance of its customers in the medical device and in vitro diagnostics sector. So now I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Akra, who will be moderating our first session. Dr. Akra?
Thank you, Sharon, for inviting me and the panelists here to discuss the EU MDR and its impact and its status on the future healthcare system in Europe. When we talk about the MDR, a lot of people are still saying it is a new regulation. Now, if it's something else, you would not say it's a new anymore because we are reaching the 4 years birthday since its publication very soon. So the regulation was published in 2017. A lot of people got aware about that regulation actually over the period from 2012 till 2017 till its publication. And now the big discussions that we are facing, and everyone is trying to understand what will be the future, what is the impact of that regulation on the future healthcare system. And I'm happy to have two notified body representatives with us today to share with us their insight. And if we look to my slide, I have one single slide presenting you some words. We see a lot of, let's say, specific wording, which are related to the medical device regulation. Its implementation, the provisions, transitional provision of that regulation, which are listed in Article 120 and so on. And one key question where everyone is asking at this moment, do we have sufficient notified bodies to be able to deal with the new regulation? And do those notified bodies have enough capacity to support the initial certification under this regulation? Kevin, what is your view on this situation at this moment? All what we have till now are 20 notified bodies. Will this be sufficient to address the market need from now till the end of the grace period, which is in 2024 in May? Are we able to get all devices moving from directive time to the regulation?
Hi, Basil. Thanks for the question. And first off, I'd just like to acknowledge that notified bodies appreciate that the MDR has introduced new challenges and requirements for manufacturers. And the low number of notified bodies designated has been one of the medical device industry's most pressing concerns. As we head towards the date of application next month and then through the grace period, we got the 20th designated EU notified body just earlier this month, which is a lot less than we have been used to having designated under the MDD. So it's definitely still a concern. I can't speak for all of the notified bodies, but at least within BSI, since 2017, we have been working tremendously hard to increase our own capacity and develop our own team to increase our ability to meet the demand for MDR certification. I know that there's still a large number of notified bodies in the queue for designation. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has stalled progress on this, you know, with on-site audits being required for the final stage of designation. I think there's something like 28, or perhaps we're expecting something like 8 more notified bodies this year, hopefully, to increase that number. But yeah, I think we'll have to adapt and meet the capacity. I think that's the onus is on notified bodies to do that, but it's still a concern. That'd be my perspective on it, Basil.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think it's a very valid point. Notified bodies have been working the last years to increase their capacity to get more resources. And if I can summarize it from that perspective, actually the number of notified body is not key, much more the capacity of notified body per designation and per designating scope, ensuring that actually the relevant capacity is available to support the market. Looking to capacity and looking to you, Matthias, and I think one key question with the medical device regulation is the clinical obligations, which are getting much more tougher in comparison to the directive. Much more clinical data based on studies are required, much more, let's say, scrutiny on the whole clinical evaluation process is required now. And in the past, when we spoke to notified bodies, we were talking to technical experts, and now happy to see that also notified bodies are having orthopedic surgeons and specialized medical doctors involved in the process. Can you tell us about your, let's say, experience, how notified bodies are also preparing themselves by increasing their specific knowledge and capacity in the different fields? Because medical devices are like wide. You don't have just orthopedic devices, you have a lot of other devices. And part of the designation scope, you need to provide the clinical capacity. Are notified bodies prepared to have all the clinical resources to address the market need as well?
Thank you, Basil, for that interesting question. As Kevin said, I can only speak for TÜV Süd, of course. I cannot speak for other notified bodies. We have a very detailed team of legal experts within TÜV Süd, so we're really trying to cover all the relevant scopes. Of course, there are, let's say, fields with a very high number of especially implantable devices, for example, cardiovascular field. In the orthopedic field, there's a huge number of implantable devices. There are other fields, let's say urology, gynecology, where there's a little bit of a smaller number of really, let's say, specific implants. So, of course, we're trying to get experts in all fields on board and trying to cover all these. But we're a little bit focusing, let's say, on the main aspects where we see the most implantable devices. And of course, there are a lot of changes, and I think the other notified bodies are going to change the structures as well. And everyone is aware now that there's a higher focus on clinical data than we had this in the past with MDD and AIMDD. In general, if you look at the definition of clinical data, the definition hasn't changed. I mean, the MDD also always required to have sufficient clinical data for medical devices, but it was a different interpretation sometimes. It was under less scrutiny. One example, of course, is all the demonstration of equivalence, which was handled much more flexible from all stakeholders under the MDD than it's now with the MDR. So this is really something where the legislator, when putting or drafting the MDR, really put a more focus on that really manufacturers should have clinical data on their own device and not rely too heavily on devices from other manufacturers with the equivalents. But then, of course, we have always the problem what to do with all those legacy devices. I mean, based on the experience we're having with TÜV Süd right now, the majority, and I'm talking about, let's say, 90% of the applications we are seeing is not for new devices. This is all for legacy devices already marketed under the MDD. And manufacturer, of course, want to keep them on the market. And there we see sometimes this kind of data gaps between, for clinical data, even for legacy devices with a long market history, because either the manufacturer was relying on equivalence in the past did not collect sufficient clinical data in the post-market setting and still now might have some data gaps, or were just not collecting enough data under the MDD, since the scrutiny was not that high for notified bodies. A lot of devices now get up-classified, will now face a review by a clinical reviewer, which was not required in the past. So there are a lot of reasons why we see, or we might see devices with have some data gaps. And of course, no one wants to see well-established devices who have a long market history, who are in everyday clinical use in Europe, to vanish from the market just because there might be some data gaps and some regulatory requirements might not be 100% fulfilled at this point. So this is why we have the MDCG guidance document 2020-6, which provides clinical data for legacy device and provides a guidance document how to, let's say, argue at this point in the transition from MDD to the MDR for those devices. And there might be a possibility to close this data gap by relying on data from, for example, similar devices, and then within a robust PMCF activity, then collect further data under the MDR.
So thank you, Matthias, for this detailed feedback on let's say, the view from a clinical point of view on the readiness of the system. I think one important additional point that we need to consider, and this is going back to you, Kevin, because we talk about now readiness of system capacity. Do we have sufficient capacity? Yes, no. And I think one important key question is not just the MDR is coming. We are having a continuous obligation according to the old system, which must be met by the notified bodies. So the Article 120 mentions that manufacturers can still make use of the grace period if they conduct, if the notified bodies are conducting appropriate surveillance of the valid certificate. How will this impact the capacity of notified bodies in the upcoming years? Are notified bodies preparing for the MDR initial certification, and considering also that they may be required to do an assessment of the old system and surveillance continuously for the next 3 years as well? And will their capacity be able then to address all of this, let's say, need without putting a burden on the healthcare system and the availability of the products?
Yeah, again, it's a good question, Basil. So again, I can really only speak for BSI on this, but I imagine other notified bodies are similar in their approach. So it's certainly a big challenge dealing with all of the different regulations, directives, the different schemes that we have to handle now. In terms of managing both MDD and MDR concurrently, we've been managing that for several years already now at this stage, and we have been dealing with early renewals of MDD certificates for the last at least 2 years. Most of them are complete by now. And at this very moment, 27th of April, we have about 4 weeks to go to the date of application. So we're have a significant focus on finishing any changes to certificates under MDD. As you point out, from the date of application until the end of the grace period, manufacturers may still have MDD certificates, which we'll have to maintain, as well as dealing with the initial MDD, the MDR certificates. So we have been preparing for that for years now, and I think BSI is in a good position to handle this. We have been adapting our processes and bringing in new processes for how we do this in terms of our procedures, our forms, our IT systems. And our aim is that we can be efficient in how we do technical documentation, such that if there are reviews ongoing, that we can document them in a certain way, that we don't have to repeat work if it's being done on MDR and MDD. So I think BSI is in a good position as regards maintaining the MDD certificates while still working on the MDR certificates.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think this is good to confirm that this is just related potentially to one notified body being ready, or two or three, with regard to the double expectations. It's more important to see how far the other notified bodies will be also prepared, and they have sufficient capacity to address really the expectation coming with Article 120. And now we spoke about actually the readiness from the notified body perspective. Matthias, can you share some insight regarding the readiness of the system? And one key question which I have for you is from a clinical point of view, where you will be involved as a clinician doing an assessment of the clinical evaluation report. The MDR brings an additional expectation, especially on class 3 implantable devices and devices which are to introduce or remove medicinal substance from the human body, where a notified body is not allowed to issue a certification decision without having an expert panel involved. How ready is the system? Do we have the expert panel already? And did they start taking applications? Do you have some experience? Perhaps you can share with us some insight on this. This will be very interesting for all the attendees of this event.
That's an interesting question. Well, the notified bodies at least were ready for this system. The expert panels were just, let's say, they went live a couple of weeks ago, beginning of April. So we finally, beginning of the year, we got the information from the European Commission, and now they have the expert panels. They have 20 expert panels, and the clinical consultation, according to Article 54, now is live. And I can only share a very limited experience so far. So far we submitted one evaluation assessment report to the expert panel. And right now, we are waiting for the feedback. So this really happened last week. So I cannot really provide any real feedback how smooth our process has been handled. Our clinical assessment of this file was concluded end of last year. But since the expert panel was not ready, we had to inform the manufacturer, of course, that we cannot proceed with the issuing of the MDR certificate because we had to wait for the expert panel. As I said, we just submitted it last week. It looks like the expert panels are, they are published. We know who will be part of those 11 subgroups in the expert panels. But at this point, I cannot really share much insight since it's related to UDAMED. UDAMED is not available. A couple of weeks ago, the MDCG 2021-1 was published regarding provisions without the UDAMED database. So there's another database system that the European Commission is using at this point. That so far I can tell works well. Apparently that worked. We got notified that they received our submission. But regarding the outcome, regarding the whole process, we probably have to repeat this webinar in a couple of months once we get the feedback from the expert panel on that.
Which is positive. At least we have a system up and running at this moment, which is not bad. And I think it's like in every new system, you need to have, let's say, the learning at the beginning where everyone would be able to understand the expectation from both sides to ensure a smooth process for the future. So which is a positive point. Thank you, Matthias, for sharing this experience. So we know that the expert panel system is live now, and you can have a submission going there. Kevin, from your point, looking to the provision of Article 120, and it's not just that you need to have like surveillance activities, there are also like some obligation which must be met by the manufacturer to be able to keep placing device on the market. And one of them is not introducing significant change to the design or to the intended purpose. The other ones are related to fulfillment of a specific obligation of the medical device regulations. How are notified bodies at this moment preparing for those requirements? Are you requesting from manufacturer to share details, and what kind of details would be necessary to ensure that you can, let's say, confirm that the manufacturer is actually fulfilling Article 120 obligations?
Okay, so as regarding significant changes under Article 120, so we've been working very closely with our manufacturers leading up to the date of application to encourage them to contact us early with regard to any significant changes. So the time is past now for them to contact us if something is going to be significant. As you said, anything which affects design or intended purpose after 26th of May 2021 cannot be, there could be no changes made to the MDD certificates when there's a significant change to design or intended purpose. So I think it's been communication early with the manufacturers leading up to now. Thereafter, so from 26th of May on, we will be liaising with the manufacturers for any changes which are not affecting design and intended purpose. So some changes to their manufacturing process, changes to certain subcontractors may be acceptable, etc. And in regards to the other aspects that they have to maintain for MDD, so that's vigilance, for example. So we'll expect manufacturers to continue to submit vigilance reports into the notified body, as well as into the competent authority. And you know, I think it's like with everything, the communication between the manufacturer and the notified body is key. So I would encourage all manufacturers to maintain regular communication with their notified body, inform the notified body of any planned changes, confirm with the notified body that they're in agreement with your plans. And you know, in the case of if you're dealing with BSI, we have an official change notification form that you would complete, submit to your scheme manager at BSI, and get confirmation that the notified body is in agreement with you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for that. And I think one point which I would like to give to Matthias as the last question before we get to the end of this session is, I think one of the obligation of Article 120 is actually to meet post-market surveillance requirement of the MDR. Does it mean for manufacturer of MDD devices, they need to have a quality management system, which is according to the MDR with regard to PMS, PMCF, PSUR, and so on? Is this what is expected?
Yes, correct. It's clearly stated that the PMS system of the MDR is applicable even if you still have a valid AIMDD or MDD certificate. So starting May this year, manufacturers need to have at least that part of the QMS system ready to fulfill the requirements of the PMS and the PMCF according to the MDR. And that means, in practical terms, that starting a year after the date of application, then meaning starting in 2022, manufacturers who still have a valid MDD certificate and keep this device on the market will need to submit their PSURs to the notified body for reviews. If it's a Class 2B implantable Class 3 device, and for Class 2A implantable will be every second year, so starting then in May 2023. Again, this process is very closely linked to the UDAMED database. The module at this point is not available. We are still waiting for the MDCG guidance document and probably a template for the PSUR evaluation report until at least we got the fully functional UDAMED.
Thank you, Matthias. And it's good to know that this is all what is needed at this moment is the system, the process, and the plans, but there is no need for a report immediately. The reports will be coming later during the time, according to the timeline which is defined in the regulation. I would like to thank both of you for the support and explanation also on the expectation of notified bodies and the view on the current readiness of the system and the readiness also of the notified bodies to address the market needs, the manufacturer need, and the initial certification as well, market continuity under the old legislation. Thank you both, and happy to be part of this panel with both of you today. Looking forward for the next discussion.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts on the key changes and challenges of the EU MDR, particularly where we are, not only from a planning perspective, resource capacity, but really sharing your perspectives on how the notified bodies are still moving forward, you know, without all the relevant pieces still being fully defined and in place. So thank you very much. I'd like to now turn our attention to the perspective of industry. As companies, both large and small, are still at various stages of MDR planning and execution. I'm very pleased today to be joined by two experienced veterans who will be sharing their perspectives and some lessons learned. First of all, Kim Troutman joins us today. Kim, as many of you know, has many years of FDA and industry experience in medical device quality systems and international regulatory affairs. And she was the chief architect behind the conception and development of the International Medical Device Single Audit Program, which we've come to know as MDSAP. Kim also wrote and harmonized the current US quality system regulation and was on the international authoring group of ISO 13485 since its inception. I'm also pleased to have Mark Schenk join us today from Tiber Medical, where he's the Vice President of Advanced Solutions and Regulatory Affairs. I love your title, Mark, particularly the Advanced Solutions part. Mark will be sharing his experience with MDR implementation from a small company perspective. And so without further delay, Kim and Mark, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And what an awesome opportunity to be part of this session, and just listening to what came before us was uplifting. And I think that's part of, you'll agree, that's part of what everyone needs to do to make themselves, avail themselves of information like these sessions. And as I was preparing for this, somebody said to me, "You're going to be on a panel with Kim Troutman." So you've updated my credibility by being on the panel with me, and I thank you. So why don't we jump into, I remember when the draft medical device regulation came out with its 566 pages, how overwhelming it was and how people were panicking. And that kind of coincided with the revision of MedDev 2.7/1 revision 4 on the clinical evaluation, and how people were panicking about how are we going to get the clinical data we need. And I know for us, that was a challenge that we had to figure out how to address.
I think it was a challenge for everybody, Mark. Not just large and small companies alike, definitely.
And one of the things that became interesting as we dug into the clinical evaluation, it started with our clinical evaluation reports and the equivalence information. One example I often use to explain to people is that it's no longer acceptable to say we have a titanium alloy screw. We have to be more specific than that, because notified bodies are more precise in their explanation of what's equivalent. And I was wondering if you had any insights on the equivalence of clinical data.
Sure. So many of the companies and clients that I have been working with, both large and small, but really the large ones have some interesting and unique problems as well, because they have so many SKUs and so many legacy products where the files, the clinical files, really go back 10, 20, 30 years. And the level of specificity is, like you said, not always there. So when you start trying to understand what type of clinical evidence you have from historical data, and I am never one to throw historical data away, okay? But to be quite frank, you can't always rely on the historical data depending on the level of specificity that you had back then. And of course, it was very hard to have the foresight of, everything that might be coming 10, 20, 30 years down the line. But you're absolutely correct. So a lot of people having to look back into the design files, looking at legacy products, looking at the level of specificity that they had, and understanding how much reliance they could use on historical data, versus truly having to sit down and say, hey, we need to put together a very focused protocol for this particular purpose, for this particular clinical point. And then, do the right statistics to find out what you needed to do. There's been quite a bit of small, focused clinical evaluation and clinical work that has had to be done because that historical data wasn't in a shape that could always be completely relied upon and used.
And one of the things that related to clinical evaluation, of course, the post-market clinical follow-up studies. And in the past, some companies had them, some didn't. But with the MDR and the detailed information that's required, I think companies are either, and the people I talk to, either having a post-market clinical follow-up study or paying somebody to do that for them, or exiting MDR for those products. And I know from the point of view of Tiber Medical, when we first encountered audits from our notified body related to the revision of MedDev 2.7/1 on the clinical evaluation, we didn't have a clinical resource in-house. And it was difficult for us to respond with their plans for our post-market clinical follow-up. So we very shortly after that invested in a director of clinical affairs who now runs our post-market clinical follow-up studies. And we have cooperation with several sites, quite a few sites. We're getting data in, and I think it's made us a better medical device manufacturer because of the increased requirements in the area of post-market clinical follow-up.
I think your experience is an excellent one. Again, for small or medium companies, it's quite an expenditure to have that type of resource readily available. But I will tell you, in our next topic, when we start talking about risk management, it is so fundamental to have that clinical experience. So the investiture of some sort of clinical expertise, whether that be full-time, a retainer, somehow not only in the pre-market for the original clinical evaluation, but for the post-market, and really making sure that you have that foundation in risk management and understanding the hazards, the harms, the hazardous situations, the frequency, and so forth, really does require some of that clinical experience and expertise. And having someone either on staff or on retainer that can continually help you with the life cycle of these activities, it is fundamentally a shift and a very wise investiture, if not a necessity, in my opinion.
I think it's very close to a necessity, and I'm not sure how else to do it. But and you mentioned risk management, the next topic. The risk management and what follows afterwards, post-market surveillance, along with clinical information, are so intertwined in the medical device regulation. And risk management, I think risk management is referenced 243 times, or risk is mentioned 243 times in the medical device regulation. It was only mentioned 56 times in the MDD. But it's almost like the way all these work together is kind of like being an air traffic controller, because you have to make sure they all speak to each other. And when you get information from your post-market clinical follow-up, it feeds into the risk management. And I think it's really been neat to see our systems evolve so that they talk to each other. But risk management is the heart of everything we do related to the medical device regulation.
Yeah, Mark, I couldn't agree. I work on standards committees in Technical Committee 176, which is the 9001 series standards. And so I've worked with folks from automotive, aerospace, telecommunications, semiconductor for almost 30 years. And it's always saddened me a bit to see how we as a medical device sector really were not as sophisticated in this risk management area through the years, to be quite frank. Other industries were traditionally doing and using these tools much better than we are. So, again, this is a very broad statement, but having, the uptick in requirements in risk management, like you said, significant uptick in expectation and requirements from the European regulation. Many of those requirements have cascaded into the ISO 14971 2019 version of the standard. And then I like to talk about a few differences that are very, very key from a practical perspective that's coming out in some of the stage 2 audits. But, you know, it absolutely is that foundational base. If you do not have good risk management foundation, it's amazing. A lot of the stage 2 audits where some of my clients were having prior to COVID on site, there was nonconformances written up under CER or post-market clinical follow-ups and so forth. But if you really got into the corrective action for those nonconformances, 9 times out of 10, it boiled down to the risk management process and not having that strong foundational base and that strong foundational data to support some of those other assertions in the CERs and the post-market clinical follow-ups, et cetera. So absolutely. But there are some very, very key differences. And Mark, I'd be interested to know if you've had some experiences with this, but we know that 14971, the 2019 version, has not, well, there's been no harmonized standards for the regulations to date, and we don't have time to get into that whole saga. But one of the problems, if you will, with harmonizing that standard still is 2 fundamental issues. And I think it's worth mentioning to the audience so that they keep it in mind. So yes, there is no harmonized standard. So you heard from TUV and BSI here a minute ago. They have the state-of-the-art requirement in the regulations that they have to assess to. So in actuality, the state-of-the-art is going to be the most current international standard on the topic. So in this case for risk management, 14971 2019. However, these 2 areas are very, very important that you keep in mind that the regulation diverges and you have to add additional requirements on top of 14971. And that is number 1, you cannot have the ALARP or as low as reasonably practical mindset, all right? Definitely has to be as low as possible. Very, very explicit in both the regulations. Now, nobody's going to tell manufacturers what as low as possible means for their particular product. So manufacturers have to have the scientific and statistical rationale to prove that they have made those decisions and those risk reductions to go as low as possible. Again, very, very purposeful by the authors of the regulations. There was a bit of tiredness and purposeful that they didn't want risk reductions always to be just throwing information into an IFU or instructions for use. They are really aiming at the fact that if there are risks, they should be designed out as the first step versus, kind of dismissed and put into an IFU. So that area is number 1. The other area that is still quite interesting is the fact that the standard requires qualitative or quantitative data. So many of you are probably used to seeing those red, yellow, green charts that are used, and ISO 14971 still allows that. I am telling you that the competent authorities, not even necessarily the notified bodies, the competent authorities that are getting involved in the vigilance and the MER report are basically de facto requiring quantitative data. They want to see the line item failure rates. They want to see the line item from that risk charts, the expected risks, the risk reductions, and that benefit risk, and how the company is constantly evaluating and reevaluating those line item numbers. This is going to be a very, very significant shift for many folks in the industry who are very used to using the charts in a qualitative way versus really shifting to what in essence is being enforced as required in this very, very, quantitative, the actual numbers and failure rates and expectations. And it does exactly what you said, Mark. It really now starts requiring the frequency to be tied to your post-market data. The harms and hazards has to be tied to that pre-market data. So you can see how the risk management is absolutely fundamental for both sides and that continuous assessment and that life cycle approach.
And one of the things that's exciting, that interaction that I described before and that you're alluding to, helps come up with the quantitative data for establishing your risk and whether it's acceptable or not. When we get feedback from our post-market clinical follow-up, it feeds into our clinical evaluation report, it feeds into our risk management report. and it's much more robust and it's much more useful for having safe product for the customers.
So let me
And-
ask you, Mark, from a post-market perspective, one of the big things, of course, is making sure that you have reactive as well as proactive. I think most companies are pretty set with the reactive complaints, adverse events. Can you talk to the audience a little bit about how you as a company has done the proactive data analysis and feedback for some of that risk management and post-market surveillance requirements?
And that's a really good question, and it's something we're gotten a lot better at. We have 2 PhDs on staff that help us look for clinical references for articles. What we've always done is looked at complaint data, in the MAUDE database and other information that's out there. But we've gotten much more detail. Like previously, we might have said, okay, the top 5 MAUDE database failures are breakage, unknown problem, and migration. But now we look in more detail to the data that's out there. And we benefit from having added resources so we can find information that's out there. And where we can, we have conversations with our customers. Tiber Medical is a private label manufacturer. So we do everything medical device companies do except distribute. And we have cooperation with our customers as a way to getting data from a retrospective study and also from a retrospective point of view. And part of our post-market clinical follow-up is looking at retrospective results for our devices. So it's another area where we've been challenged to improve the data that we use. And I thank you for the question.
Yeah, one of the other things that I'm finding people having difficulty on is a lot of the original pre-market data, clinical evaluation data, was collected in a fashion or a metadata form that was very, very specific to that market entry applications, all right, whether it be the EU or the US or anywhere, to be quite frank. And that data was collected in such a way. Now you look at the post-market data, and the post-market data coming in from the traditional complaints, adverse event, but also now, like you said, some of the proactive literature, surveys, and so forth. And its metadata is often collected very, very differently. So I have a lot of folks that I've been working with 2 sets of metadata, and it's really apples and oranges. And the difficulty is now trying to find a way to normalize that data in order to meet the requirements of that continuous assessment. So I think it's challenging folks, especially as opportunities come forward with new product lines, or even if it's remediation of older legacy product files, to really think in the pre-market space ahead of time. How is that data going to be collected and analyzed in the post-market such that you can have data in similar formats to make it easier to do that continuous update and continuous improvement? This is something that I think is going to evolve over time. I don't think it's going to be flipping a switch and everything's going to be perfect. I do believe that this is going to be an evolution in our industry over the next 5 to 7 years, honing in some of that risk management, but thinking ahead of how the data is being collected on both sides of the pre and post market, I think is going to be key for us to be able to more efficiently get into some of these routines and patterns of using real world data.
And we're fortunate, we've been finding a good correlation between our pre-market clinical data and our post-market data. So that's something we've done well. But I will say with our new products that we're developing, it is challenging to set a good foundation. I appreciate your feedback. One thing well, because MD-SAP, of course, is information from manufacturers. That's something that's a challenge for companies because contract manufacturers, manufacturers of special processes have proprietary information that they don't want to share. And what we've done is tried to help them by coming up with templates and checklists for them to provide us information. And I think that's something that we're still developing how to do that moving forward. And it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And I think the good thing is it puts the onus on the manufacturer of record to have better supplier management. And that's another thing here at Tiber Medical. We've added a senior director of supplier quality. That's all that individual does, working with our team, because we know it's an area where we had to add a lot more data.
Yeah, so I would comment that it was very, very purposeful in our International Standards Committee of 13485, even back in 2016, knowing the importance of really tightening up the supply chain and the controls on suppliers. Because once upon a time when I worked in industry, we won't say how many years ago, but over 30 years ago, everything was all in one little building, or at least in one little campus with, clustered buildings. But that's not how things really are, is working these days. It's global. You've got things coming from all different parts of the globe and world. And you're right, it really puts the onus and the impetus on that legal manufacturer to really understand all those different pieces, parts, specifications, and outsource services. So in 13485, we always struggled as a standards group, with that outsourced service clause. But very, very specifically, one of the most important things for outsourced services is to ensure that there is a quality agreement. And this is really where getting into good quality agreements allows the legal manufacturer and the suppliers to hash out what you said, exactly how some of that critical information is going to be exchanged and what roles and responsibility each of the parties is going to have, because they're both integral. They can't do it alone, either party, but it has to be very, very clearly laid out in some good quality agreements. So long gone are the days where the quality agreement was just a few sentences, notify us of changes and blah, blah, blah. There really is an uptick in requirements and expectations for some of those supplier arrangements and quality agreements.
And the one thing that I think MDR related that's noteworthy is the materials that go into those agreements and the specifics of the hazardous materials. That's something that we've had to increase the data, the information in our agreements as well. And I think we're coming near the end of our session, and I just wanted to point out that from a small company, we had to make several decisions on the build or buy equation, so to speak, whether we were going to add resources in-house or outsource some of the processes. Related to clinical data, we've hired, as I said previously, a full-time director of clinical affairs, but the portal for our post-market clinical follow-up, we outsource that. And there's a company that has a system that works well for gathering this kind of data. So that's an example of things we've done. We take advantage of participating in groups like OSMA, the Orthopedic Surgical Manufacturers Association, to gather data. But there's so many decisions, especially for a smaller company, to decide what you're going to bring in-house and invest in, and how we're going to take advantage of people in your industry to help us with training and facilitating some of those activities. And that's something I find is key to the success in the MDR conversion, because you can't do it all yourself, especially as a small company, and it benefits us to take advantage of expertise of people like yourself.
Well, thank you, Mark. Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's tough decisions as to what to bring in-house and what to outsource and get assistance on, where, there's processes and procedures and people can crank through. And they're very, very individual decisions, but manufacturers are going to have to look at that. They're going to have to look at the number of product lines they have and how they want to, have a strategy moving forward, understanding that these are long-term requirements. And honestly, the expectations are only going to continue to go up. I think, over the next 5 to 7 years, we're going to see a lot of waves, a little bit of a rocky road as to how some of this is all, uniformly enforced. But I think, whether people choose to do things in-house or to outsource are all very, very valid decisions that folks have to make and continue to make as they go forward and evolve with this new regulation. Sorry, Basil.
Thank you all, well, Kim and Mark. That was an excellent exchange of information. It certainly gave us all a lot more to think about as we move forward on our individual MDR journeys. Thank you to all our speakers. It's certainly very clear, evident from all these discussions today that MDR has really had a profound impact on both regulators as well as industry. And so I'd like to invite all of our speakers back and I'd like to pose a couple of questions to our panelists. And I will start with Dr. Fink. Dr. Fink, and maybe this is a little bit of a philosophical question, but how have notified bodies shifted their priorities in preparation for MDR? I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but what are some of those burning issues that continue to keep you and perhaps other notified bodies up at night?
Interesting question. Well, personally, with my background as a trauma surgeon for 70 years, I'm used to be up at night, and I can assure you the MDR does not keep me up at night. So luckily, I have a good night of sleep. But of course, I mean, there are a lot of open issues. We touched them a little bit in our previous discussions. I think one issue is still let's say, delay of certain guidance documents, or the fact that certain guidance documents were just published very recently, let's say in the last 6 to 12 months. So there's still an ongoing and sometimes changing interpretation of certain aspects of the MDR. We started to work on our first MDR protective suite over 2 years ago, before we even had those templates for, let's say, PMCF plan, PMCF reports. So there was a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainties on manufacturers are on our side. So we are trying to keep everyone ready. On the other hand, of course, we have to make sure that we still have the resources to continue our surveillance activities under the MDD, since we have the grace period until 2024. So we are really making sure that we are allocating enough resources for the MDR, but also still have enough resources who still can work on MDD projects. So it's a little bit of a moving target right now. So once we get a new MDG document or something like that, we have to make sure that we quickly adapt them into our own processes.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Dr. Fink. And I'm very glad you're not kept up at night. And maybe that's a nice lead into a question for Dr. Akra. Given that, there's still elements of MDR that are a bit uncertain and still evolving, what would be the best advice that you would give to a manufacturer who might still be struggling or encountering challenges with different facets of MDR interpretation or implementation?
I think the best advice that I can give, Sharon, to manufacturers is just do it based on your best knowledge, because you can't change the fact that this is still unclear. It's a new regulation from the interpretation point of view. Notified bodies, manufacturers, competent authorities, everyone is learning. And if I look back, the directives were published in the 90s. I remember my time at the notified body, where we were still discussing till my last day at the notified body, directive interpretation. And I think this is the job securities that we have, all of us in the regulatory field and the quality field. Without interpretation, we don't need to be there. So we need to make sure that we interpret the regulation to the best knowledge, and we keep in mind whenever we are putting interpretation that the patient is centric in our decision, and all what we are doing is actually toward getting safe devices and devices which are fulfilling the obligation with regard to benefit risk profile, and this is important. If we do it in that way, I think notified bodies will accept that. And we had recently a session with the European Commission where it was very clear that even if a guidance document is published immediately, it's not immediately directly on that day when it's published, let's say, the current interpretations that you have to apply. you need to consider timeline, and you need to make sure that what is the risk associated with that change, and make sure that you adopt it, but you have a clear plan for that.
Great, excellent. And I imagine the importance too, more than ever, of staying in close contact with your notified bodies and sharing best knowledge, and as some of these are still remaining yet to be sorted through. So thank you. Kevin, my next question is for you. I'm sure that we'll have many suppliers joining our call here today, or our session today. What is your key message to suppliers in particular, and how best to work with their OEMs to achieve compliance under the MDR, given the fact that this is in fact a shared responsibility?
Sure, thanks, Sharon. So I think it's similar to what Basil just went through, really, in that the supplier, much like the legal manufacturer, they need to read the MDR, they need to do their best to comply with the actual regulation written down in the MDR, but also that there's lots of resources available, publicly available, for manufacturers, but also suppliers. If for example, on the BSI website, there are multiple guides, documents, white papers, webinars, and other training resources that they can publicly access on all the different topics across the MDR. So it's not for lack of resources that people should be struggling with interpretation. I suppose then it's all about communication. The supplier, like, we're used to dealing directly with the legal manufacturer, and so the communication link between the notified body and the manufacturer is key. But I guess then it extends supplier to legal manufacturer communication is key, that they have clear expectations and are also working on things well ahead of time, because the grace period that we're entering into, it's relatively short. It's only 3 years now, and notified body capacity is tight, it's finite capacity, and manufacturers need to submit their MDR applications quickly in order to get their MDR certification in time. So yeah, that's it. Communication, I think, across the board.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Kevin. Yes, communication across the board, especially between OEMs and suppliers, are very important. Okay, we'll shift gears a little bit. Kim, the next question is being tossed over to you. And this has to do with clinical data under MDR for legacy devices. And you did speak a bit about this earlier, but how have you found in your experience that companies are approaching the need for clinical data under MDR, specifically for those legacy devices? As we know, many of these devices have a very long history of clinical use, which is often seen in orthopedics, as we know. And what are the typical stumbling blocks to establishing that clinical equivalence? And Kim, you might be on mute.
Yep, thank you. First and foremost, I think what's probably been done over the past 3 years, and most of the people I've worked with have been doing this, from the start, is really going through and looking through the line items, looking through the SKUs, and making some hard business decisions, quite frankly, because some of those legacy products just don't have the clinical evaluation data that is now expected and required, and making decisions as to whether that particular SKU should be continued in Europe, continued globally, to be quite frankly. A lot of customization, if you will, where there's been small tweaks and so forth, maybe for a particular sector, but the volume is low. They've had to make some tough decisions to say, we're not going to provide that, version because going and remediating the clinical data from that legacy product really just isn't cost beneficial. So a lot of, and it's probably a good thing, right? The other thing that's been very, very helpful with regard to clinical data, as well as risk management, post-market surveillance, and so forth, is really battening down the concept of medical device families. If a company really does a good job of appropriately aggregating medical device SKUs into device families, you can really leverage a lot of good based clinical data, post-market data, risk management data for the entire family. And then that's where I was saying you can get into some very, very focused protocols and so forth that fill in the gaps. So the work, it might seem like it's a lot of work with, not a lot of movement forward, but some of that fundamental work of really going through and making sure that you get rid of some of the SKUs that just don't make sense to remediate, that you do a really good job. And like I said, appropriate, it has to be like and similar. So don't put apples and oranges together, but accumulating good medical device families. And then with that family, leveraging some good core base information, and then filling in the gaps with very focused protocols and clinical evaluation is really probably the smartest way most companies have been moving forward in that regard.
Excellent. And that is something that is very key in orthopedics, the concept of multiple configurations and sizes. So definitely echo your point around establishing the definitions of systems and families. Mark, I'm going to toss my last question to you. And you really shared some very interesting perspectives, unique perspectives today from the perspective of a small device manufacturer. But I'm curious to know, what have you found to be those most important elements to ensuring successful MDR preparation and execution? And were you, on your own company's journey, were there any surprises along the way, or things that you wish you might have done differently?
And thank you for the question. And we found the key is the clinical information. Like you hear every conversation about MDR includes some comment about clinical information. And for us, moving from clinical information being a challenge to the way we do our post-market clinical follow-up and our whole clinical evaluation being a competitive advantage because we chose to invest in that. That was key. Taking opportunity to learn about MDR, going to training, joining groups, looking at or observing presentations like this. Those are all key to the process, and actually knowing the MDR. Last week we had our remote MDR quality system audit, and what was refreshing is because we're a small team, we have to know everything. And there were portions of the conversation where the auditor is going through their checklist. And then I would say we made this decision because Article 2, Section 3 says this. And within minutes, we can go from a conversation about a topic to the specific reference in the medical device regulation. And that's kind of a surprise because we're pleased to have had a good audit last week. And one of the surprises is we really know what we're doing. When we have conversation with our customers, they're bigger medical device companies. And if the conversation goes to the medical device regulation, and I begin describing part of the process here, they often will stop me and say, we need 5 more people to get on the call with you. Because as a small manufacturer, we don't have the luxury of creating intellectual silos. We have to do it all in our small team and invest in the team and have the learning and education and cooperation that makes it successful. And one last, a little bit humorous or anecdote, we can't register with the UDIMED right now because our authorized representative can't get an SRN because their competent authority won't allow them. So there's still challenges like that to be overcome. And we handle them one challenge at a time and move forward.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Well, this brings us to the end of an excellent session. And I wanted to close by thanking all of our speakers today who've offered, very personal, insightful perspectives and have given us all very important things to consider as we continue to tackle today's challenges and navigate a clear path forward to MDR compliance. A special thank you to OrthoWorld and our sponsor for this session, MedTorque, and to you, our audience, for your continued interest in this important topic. Goodbye for now, and have a great day.
Thank you to Sharon and the panel for their excellent conversation. I want to echo Sharon's comments and say thank you to our panel for joining us today and providing great insight based on their MDR experiences. And thank you to those watching. MDR is a critical topic for the orthopedic industry, and our hope is that you gain knowledge as you continue to implement your regulatory strategy. You can learn more about our sponsor MedTorque at medtorque.com, and you can access more regulatory-focused education, including more expertise from these panelists, at omtechexpo.com.